Well, on this Veterans Day weekend, we'll be looking at a battle from the Old Testament that begins in Judges chapter 7. And this launches a series that we've simply entitled Enough. And contrary to what you might hope, that title is not a reference to the beard growth that I have for the past couple weeks. You might say that it's enough, but I've only need one approval from one person who desires that her husband grow a beard at least once a year, and so this is the month that I usually don't shave. And so if you dislike this look, then I apologize, but you'll have to take that up with my lovely missus. So that's not the enough we're talking about. We're talking about really this very simple question: what's enough in our life? What's enough in our life related to a whole range of things. And we'll conclude this service, this series, Sunday, November 24th in the evening at 6 o'clock p.m., where we invite you and other sister congregations of Calvert City to worship right here in our ecumenical Thanksgiving service. So let's take a look at Judges chapter 7, verses 1 through 8 as we begin. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the troops that were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them, below the hill of Moreh in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, "The troops with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand. Israel would only take the credit away from me, saying, my own hand has delivered me. Now therefore proclaim this in the hearing of the troops. Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home." Then Gideon sifted them out. 22,000 returned, and 10,000 remained. Then the Lord said to Gideon, "The troops are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will sift them out for you there. When I say, 'This one shall go with you,' he shall go with you. And when I say, 'This one shall not go with you,' he shall not go." So he brought the troops down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, "All those who lap the water with their tongues, as a dog laps, you shall put to one side. All those who kneel to drink, putting their hands to their mouths, you shall put to the other side." The number of those that lapped was 300, but all the rest of the troops knelt down to drink water. The Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 that lapped, I will deliver you, and give the Midianites into your hand. Let all the others go to their homes." So he took the jars of the troops from their hands and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel back to their own tents, but retained the 300. The camp of Midian was below him in the valley. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Let's show you a picture of the setting of what the hill of Moreh looks like. On the screen here, you see the plain of Israel, and that hill in the background is actually the place we're talking about, where this battle would have taken place. It's at the northeast corner of the Jezreel Valley. And it's associated, this place is the one that's associated with Gideon's battle against the Midianites. This figure shows that particular valley. In chapter 7, verse 1, the Midianites were camped in that particular valley near the hill of Moreh prior to Gideon's attack upon the Midianites. Kind of a little bit of backstory of this particular passage of Scripture. Israel was at a time when they were at war with a group of people known as the Midianites. And Israel was led by this kind of no-name guy. Really, he was a nobody. He was in his family and his social status. In fact, Gideon self-identified as being someone who was from the weakest clan, that being the clan of Manasseh, or the tribe of Manasseh, rather, among the weakest clan in the tribe of Manasseh. And he said, in fact, I'm the least kind of person in my own family. And so here we have a person who was asked to leave Israel that self-identified as a nobody of nobodies. Someone who self-identified and claimed to have no status other than just this regular Joe, this regular guy who no one expected anything from. And so maybe we wrestle with this and recognize who this person is. And our first lesson this morning is to recognize that if we've ever felt like someone who is less than, someone who is inferior than those around us, we might be in good company. Because it's oftentimes people such as this who God uses for God's holy purposes. Gideon was someone who felt least able and capable to be called. And he was called to embark upon this battle, this holy war, so to speak, with less than a strong supporting cast. A tribe of people, an army of soldiers that started at 32,000, God says this is too many. In fact, God sends away the 22,000. He said there are some people who I know who are fearful. And these people are not cut out for this particular task, perhaps. Not that we don't recognize our own fear, but for this particular task, God sent them away. 22,000 people went home and were dismissed from their duty as soldiers. 10,000 people remained, and God continued to filter through the 10,000 that remained. And he said, those who lap, kind of separate those out, and those who kneel down to drink water at the river, separate those out. And so from that separation, God continued to dismiss 9,700 soldiers for this particular task. And there were 300 people who drank in a certain way that God called them to drink, according to a particular way. And it's kind of a little bit confusing if you read this passage closely, but the same words that's used that means lapped in the Hebrew language kind of is used interchangeably. But what we can identify is that we're talking about the smaller number that was retained. The smaller number that God said, this is in fact enough for us, for you, Gideon, to lead into battle. And so they took water up into their palm of their hands, and these 300 who drank in this way were those who identified as being ready and prepared to accomplish God's purposes. So what is it about the 300 who remained versus the 9,700 who were dismissed? Do we really care how people drink or eat or hold a sandwich or whatever? I don't think that's really the point of this passage, but if you just think about the 9,700 kneeling with their heads in the water, those who were dismissed, if I'm reaching down and bringing my head to the water to drink, the only thing that I can see is that water which is in front of me. And it's very hard and very difficult to keep an eye on my surroundings. And perhaps these were people whom God dismissed because of their lack of attentiveness. They weren't able to pay attention to the potential threats that were around them. And also, if that weren't bothersome for General Gideon, the one commentator says they were also susceptible to a little thing called leeches, if they were so close to the water, getting their face into the running water. And so 300, 9,700 versus how many people are we talking about? Well, if we look at Judges chapter 8, if you read further, we're talking about an army of 300 versus the likes of 135,000 soldiers of the Midianite army. And God would ask Gideon, and you can see why he may have been a little bit nervous, why he felt even more inferior than the attitude, the self-esteem that he brought to the situation to begin with. 300 versus 135,000 people. God told Gideon to sneak near the Midian people in the valley and to encourage them he encouraged them to share a dream that God revealed to Gideon. And Gideon told the dream to his soldiers, and he imagined that those 300 people attacked them in the night. And they sent the people running, and that was the dream that Gideon shared with the army of the 300 people. And in fact, of course, if you read on, that's basically what happens. Through the 300, God defeats 135,000 peoples of a foreign nation who worship foreign gods. And I know that this is really hard. I don't really think this is something that we need to really quantify, but that's the best way we have to understand what was really at stake in this particular passage. How unlikely the outcome would have been without the divine providence of God working in the lives of Midian and those 300 soldiers. And if you're someone who likes to quantify things and subscribe to proportions and odds, then you know that the odds were not in the favor of the Israelite people. But I remind us that people of faith don't always make every single decision based on data. Don't make every single decision based on what the odds makers might tell us. Because if we are people of faith, our faith, the whole of we as the body of Christ is oftentimes greater than the sum of our individual parts. even against insurmountable odds. I mean, can you think about perhaps a time in your life when you knew you were against insurmountable odds? Perhaps a time in your life when you sought a certain position, a certain job that you were pursuing. And you knew there were tons of candidates, and you knew how unlikely it was that out of those tons of candidates, you would have been the one that would have been chosen and awarded, making the interview process and going through and finding that job you were pursuing. Maybe a certain relationship went south because of what you thought was honesty, and that trust was broken in your relationship. And God, through that relationship, continued to minister alongside you and to minister to you. And against insurmountable gods, that relationship where that trust was broken was restored. And you recognize and look back on that season of life when you recognize that God alone could do that against insurmountable odds. Perhaps the doctor gave someone in your life, in your family, a diagnosis of cancer. And against insurmountable odds, you were blessed with a lifespan that far exceeded what the doctors would have predicted otherwise had it not been for the hand of God at work in your life. Sometimes with the people of faith, I think that's the very basic truth that we see in this principle, is that sometimes less is more. Sometimes less is more. I think back to the last year of seminary. One of my professors shared a very hard reality with us. I think I was 2 years away from graduating, so I was kind of mid-season and through seminary. And the professor just talked to us very candidly about persons who are about to be graduated, maybe a semester away from being graduated, and realizing the weight of the reality of becoming a pastor or minister in whatever vocation they were called to. And realizing that suddenly they were about to have to use the education and the experience, the leadership skills that they had gained in a very short matter of time, and suddenly realizing and having this weight on their shoulders and thinking, am I capable? Am I enough? Am I going to be successful in light of the things that I feel incapable of doing? Sometimes we realize that we're nervous. Sometimes we may feel inadequate, incapable of doing the thing that God has asked us to do. But I submit to you and suggest that perhaps those are the moments when we're most faithful. Those are the moments when perhaps we're most reliant upon the grace of God, even when we realize the odds are not in our favor. God told Gideon, separate some of those, thin out the crowd, thin out the army of soldiers, and he returned to Gideon saying, the troops are still too many. The Lord said to Gideon, the troops were too many for God to give the enemy into their hand. Israel would only take the credit away from me, saying, my own hand has delivered me. And so the question I ask of us today, this morning, one of them is, are we giving credit to ourselves or to God? Do we boast in our successes but blame God for our failures? Do we trust that even when we seem to have less resources around us, do we trust in this moment, as Gideon did, that God is enough? And I think there's a whole world of people today who don't consciously credit God. Maybe they deny God. They don't embrace a particular kind of faith. And I suggest that perhaps if we do not consciously credit God, if we do not consciously credit God, we unconsciously discredit God. In other words, the act of worship, the act of our very being here today, the act of your presence is an act of ministry. It's an act in ministry and faithfulness where we acknowledge God the Father, where we acknowledge that there's something beyond ourselves that matters to us. There's something beyond ourselves that calls us here. And this is the God that we worship, the Yahweh who delivered the Israelites from the hands of the Midianites with less, not more. That is our particular theme for this particular series. And to the 300 people who remain that God thinned out, God clearly communicated to them that God wanted to be enough for them. God basically said, I am enough. A couple weeks ago, I was at a meeting, and we were talking about the nature of small churches. A pastor, a peer pastor of mine, had talked about a church of about 50 or 60 people. Maybe you've encountered many churches like this. Maybe you've been a part of one and worshiping at one in the past, but a church of about 50 or 60 people decided that it was time for them to get radically committed to their faith. And those 50 or 60 people who gathered really began to dream about what God had in store for them as a community of faith. And they began to pray certain things, and they settled on 4 or 5 particular things that they were going to be committed to and live into. And one of those things that they committed to was they began to pray something so bold, so unlikely, that only God, that they would see God move in their midst in such a way that only God's self could get the credit for answering that prayer. In other words, if they saw good things happen, they weren't going to put plaques on the wall dedicated to certain people. They were going to give the credit entirely, 100% to God the Father. And do you know that church of 50 or 60 people a couple years later became a church of about 120 or 130 people? And they started with a dream and a plan, an agreement upon the things that they were going to live into. And their priority was that God would receive all the credit, all the praise, all the glory, not any one of themselves. I don't think it's really terrible to feel like we have insurmountable odds against us. I don't think that when we hear that the world's is eroding with the moral fabric of the country, that's a terrible time for the life of the church. Because we realize when we feel up against insurmountable odds that sometimes that might be exactly where God's calling us to be. That might be the time when we are ripe to be used to make a difference in our community, our kingdom, and our world. That might be the time in which God calls us to an increased dependence upon God. I think God prefers our faithful dependence over our overconfident selves. And so what about these 300 people who God determined were ready for battle? I think it means to me that God recognized that they were prepared to live into the mission that God was calling them to do. And it's interesting to me that in an army of 300 people, God used those 300 people, and I just began to wonder, how many people do we exactly have on our rolls? This may be something you're interested in knowing. We declared on our annual paperwork just that we completed a couple weeks ago that we have 271 baptized members who are connected to the Calvert City United Methodist Church. 271. We average around 140 average attendees on a Sunday morning. We have 89 people who are not baptized members who we care for, who are within our stewardship that we're responsible to care for. And if you add up those, we're somewhere looking around 360 people that we care for that are involved in the life of this church in some capacity. And so the next question is, what is our mission? Are we committed to our mission? In looking at paperwork, I found that this was what was declared as our mission. Maybe you all were involved in the decision-making process, that a team of people who came up with this purpose statement. It goes beyond what's listed on our bulletin on the front. If you notice, every single Sunday our mission, it says, is offering Christ. Well, I didn't know what the ... meant. And so I found that the ... stands for this. Our mission is to fulfill the Great Commission by offering Christ, building community, growing in grace, and serving with Christ in the church and the world. That is, as far as I can tell, what our stated mission is. We did some of those things this past week. On Friday morning, we served veterans, and many of you served fish at a fish fry at First Baptist Church with our sister congregation in the community. On Thursday night, we had some 47 volunteers who signed a sign-in sheet, and there were probably 20 or 30 more who didn't. And we had dozens and dozens of people from the community, many people who spent who spent a lot of hot, tiring hours in a kitchen cooking spaghetti for our neighbors that ultimately benefited those who were in need in our community during this Christmas season. We had people of Calvert City United Methodist Church, people of different faiths and people I'm sure of no faith, serving alongside one another. And it was a sight to see. One of the things that I'd been concerned about is related to this particular ministry that happened Thursday night is, do we have enough? Do we have enough resources? Do we have enough people? Do we have enough trust to imagine that we can make this happen in a new and different way? To reach those who have previously been unreached? And if you were here Thursday night, I think the resounding answer to that is yes. We had plenty. We had enough. And I think one of the things that I want us to be mindful of is to remember is that we don't just have the resources available to us that are here. The resources of Calvert City United Methodist Church are also the resources of Calvert City, Kentucky. The resources of Calvert City, Kentucky are also the resources of Calvert City United Methodist Church. And our resources that are available to us extend beyond the walls of this church. And we saw it in bodily form on Thursday night when there was barely room to sit down and eat spaghetti. We have enough people, I believe, to complete and to live into our mission. I hope if you're here that as we move forward, that you'll be among those people who are prepared to live into our mission. And maybe we refine that as we go. We'll talk about that in some months to come. But I want to ask a question. I want you to ask the very same of me. Like Gideon, as the army of Israelites were thinned out, I'm sure Gideon wanted to know if he could count on those 300 people. If he could count on those who had dwindled down from thousands and thousands of people to now 300. I'm sure he wanted to know if he could count on each one of them. And so I hope that I can count on you. And as you ask the same question of me, as you ask, can I count on my pastor? I think the answer, the undeniable, unequivocal answer for us is that I can count on you and you can count on me if and only if we are counting on God. Because God is enough. As the band comes forward, I want us to be challenged by that and remember that in our days ahead and the Sundays ahead. I want us to think about what is enough for us. And I believe that we have enough people, enough manpower, enough woman power, enough child power in this place to be reminded that God is enough. We invite you to stand, sing, and praise with us.